This is the Bama Podcast with Marty Solomon. I'm his co-host, Brent Billings. Today we explore the final 3 chapters of understanding the Jewish roots of Christianity, discussing the Jewish character of the church, and puzzling through what difference it makes to our lives as Christians.
Yeah. You know, one of the things about how we do things, Brent, is we always kind of record a few weeks ahead so that we have episode content in the hopper ready for you to produce and ready to go. What that means is that as we record this today, we just kind of like released this week the episode a few episodes ago where we talked to Jen Rosner that kind of kicked off this series about this book that we're going through. And because of that, we got like feedback. And I wanted to just add some comments because I thought this feedback was particularly interesting and I wanted to give comment to it because some of it's really important. And I always find it so interesting, like which episodes people gravitate towards, like which episodes generate such different kind of feedback, and the comments go crazy, and people write emails, and it's always so interesting to see. I would never anticipate which episodes produce that kind of stuff, but that episode with Jen, let's see, what number of episode would that have been, Brent?
That was 234.
234, episode 234 with Jen Rosner, And yeah, and so if I were to put it on like a diagram, it would be quadrants. There were people that heard what we were trying to say and loved it. And to that group, I say that's awesome. Thank you. I was really actually kind of surprised by how much positive, like people were like, I love that episode. That was so great. I hope this series has been helpful. I know it's been kind of weird. Like it's probably for a lot of people, the last few episodes probably aren't your favorite episodes. It's like Marty reading excerpts out of a book. Like it's kind of weird. I won't make a habit out of doing that. I'm hoping that for some of you, maybe it's been like, yeah, I've loved that. No, I want to get that book. It's really helpful to hear. And then there were some that like understood what we were saying and didn't love it, because they wanted to like, okay, but you didn't tell us anything. And to that, I would just say yes. So when we do these guest interviews, part of what we're doing is we're trying to share resources with you and then help out fellow friends, usually authors who have written a book. So if I tell you all the content of the book, then I kind of ruin it for the person who's trying to make a living by writing books.
Well, even so, like we're not recording an audiobook, so it's not the whole thing either way.
Right.
And so if we summarize it and give you all the key points, like maybe we're not even pulling the key points that you would take away from the book. So it's not even
sure. Yeah.
It's not even just like, oh, we're trying to protect the money that the author gets, which is honestly probably not as much as you would think it is. And the whole publishing industry is complicated like that. So
yeah, especially the people that we're talking
careful
to.
with your assumptions.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it's not even that. It's like we want people to engage the material because we think it's valuable. But just as we talked about we can't predict which episodes are going to resonate with people in what ways. We're not going to predict what part of a book is going to resonate with you. We just think that the book as a whole is valuable. So we want to share some ideas, give you an idea of what is in it, but we really want you to engage with it. Not that you're required by any means.
Right.
But that is the hope is something will intrigue you and you'll engage with it yourself.
Yeah, this whole podcast is about teaching us how to think, how to ask better questions, and pointing you towards resources. And when you find a resource, when you hear about one that you're like, oh, I want more of that, well, then there you go. And that's what we want to do. We want to connect because we're not the experts. I am not the expert. I love to read the experts, and I love to talk about the experts. And I love to talk about what I've learned from the experts. But I'm not the expert, nor is Brent, at least not about this content. And there you go. And then there was a whole other group of people. Those are 2 quadrants. And then there's 2 other quadrants, Brent. There are people who did not understand what we were doing and loved it. So a very dominant response was to that episode, for some reason, was a whole bunch of people going, oh, great, Marty now loves Messianic Judaism. Which was not necessarily what I was trying to communicate. It wasn't like I've been frustrated by many aspects of the Messianic Judaism that I have encountered. What I was trying to communicate through that episode was that I am learning that the world of Messianic Judaism is much bigger than I thought it was. I had put it in a box. I had stereotyped. Let me be very clear. The same things that frustrated me before continue to frustrate me. I just now understand where some of those things are coming from. And I also understand that there's part of that world that I had not met before. And that part is really blessing me. And I'm learning from it. That's what I was trying to communicate. Not that I have like radically changed my position on some of those other issues that I've given word to, but that I'm learning that there's other things that I don't know. And Brent, that was important because part of what I want to do on this podcast is model. I want to model that. I want to model as somebody who has a voice, whatever you want to call it, a platform, whatever, a podcast, and influence somebody. I'm able to say like, man, I didn't know that. I learned something new. And thank you for teaching me. So that part of that was done not as performance art, but very intentionally so that people could see that. And we don't see that in our leaders enough. And so part of it is trying to model that. Did I say that well, Brent?
Yeah, I think so. Okay.
And then there's a fourth quadrant who didn't understand what we were saying and didn't like it. And but actually, that's not on them. By the way, both of these quadrants who didn't understand what we were saying is not on them. It's mostly on me. Probably completely on me, to be honest. That is not on the listener. But that last quadrant actually said some things that are very, very important to me. Some of the voices that spoke, emailed, might have been on Slack, personal messages. I got to hear from a few different voices, a handful of different voices that said, man, that kind of felt like it was just about you, Marty. Like it was just you and Jen, and you and Jen as Jews, and we're not Jews. So we just have to like kind of watch you from a distance, and we don't really get to be Jews. And you're really clear about that. But that was really weird. It was just about you and your story and what you thought. And I feel like it was just very you-centric. I did not intend that. So that was, I can absolutely see how that episode was heard that way. And I want to affirm that and just say I'm sorry, because I honestly, legitimately did not intend to communicate that at all. I did want to model some things intentionally. I want to share my life with others. I do want to be in relationship as a Jewish follower of Jesus. I want to be in relationship with evangelicals, Gentile evangelicals. And I want that relationship. We're going to actually talk about that in today's episode with this book, Brent. There's something to that relationship that I want to be very open and very intentional. And I want to be able to engage that. And by the way, I have tried to be super clear about like the dangers of Gentile appropriation. And I may have overdone it on some level. So if I backtrack for just a moment here to say, I absolutely 100% believe that Gentiles, you're not just watching a story that you don't get to engage in. You're supposed to be totally engaged and learning from the story. You're just not supposed to be under that covenant. And man, we're going to talk about some of this stuff, aren't we, today, Brent? Yeah?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, we should probably just move on to the episode. But please don't hear me say, like, there's a Jewish thing going on over here, and you don't get to be a part of it, and you just need to, like, watch from a distance. No. The whole story, like, if that were true, this whole podcast would be a colossal waste of our time. The whole point is to learn from that Jewish story, to learn from the Jewish narrative, to learn from the Jewish people, to learn from their traditions and how they see it in their perspective. And the whole point is to be fully engaged and learn so that we truly know how to engage it in our world, Jew or Gentile. But rather than keep talking, we should probably dive in, because really that's exactly what our conversation today is going to be about. So unless you have something to add, Brent, how about you? Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to clarify one thing, because you, I think the struggle is whether or not we speak for our listeners when we are recording episodes. So as we're having conversations with people, we don't want to assume that all of our listeners, just because they've listened to the whole podcast or whatever, have all of the same views as us. And so we want to approach conversations and topics and subjects as someone realizing like, oh, we have our own individual opinions and we're going to approach something with those opinions, but we're not going to assume that everyone else holds those same opinions.
Oh goodness, yes.
So we're not obligating anyone to feel the same way that we do or have the same convictions that we do or whatever. So in I think maybe in doing that, it's made it seem like, oh, this is just us and nobody else gets to come along. But that's not what we're trying to do.
No. And that's I really appreciate you saying that, Brent. Because I have my experiences and I have my opinions and things that I want to point out and point to, but I don't get to make the call. Like I'm just like any of you listening. Like I don't get to make the call on Messianic Judaism. Like there have to be. I know there are a ton of listeners that disagree with me on those points. I would expect that. I would want that. I would encourage that. Please do. And man, Brent, I know we've been listening to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. And if there's anything to learn from that, it's that we are not trying to create some monolithic group and some monolithic platform and some monolithic personality. Golly, the moment we do that, we get into some dangerous waters. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So
I'm going to link that whole podcast in our show notes. Yeah. If you have not listened to that, check it out.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's yeah. And there's all kinds of things. Maybe we can do an episode kind of on that because we're not saying check it out and be entertained by it. We're saying check it out because there's some really provocative things we need to be thinking about. We're not saying there's not nuances. Again, there are people even on the Beimad teaching team that see that podcast radically differently. So, but to be thinking and to be learning from things that we've seen, and we need to be held accountable to a larger group of people. This is not just the Brent and Marty show.
There have been a couple episodes in that podcast where I have seen so clearly some of my own church history and background and thought, oh no.
Yeah.
Like when my church talked about that, they said it in this like positive,
yep,
like, oh, this is how we want to do things and this is the best way to do it. And it's like, oh no, it turns out that just because you're doing it that way doesn't mean it's the right way. Like you can still corrupt it if you don't have the right systems of accountability in place.
Yep.
So yeah, it's not a recommendation for an entertainment podcast. It is a recommendation to reflect on what kind of structures we have around us and whether or not we're actually pointing to Jesus or not.
Amen and amen. All right, chapter 11.
Oh man, this episode.
Chapter 11.
We got to get into it.
Here we go. Get us into it, Brent.
All right, this is titled Messianic Judaism, Recovering the Jewish Character of the Ecclesia. This is by Mark S. Kinzer. He is the moderator of Yahad Be Yeshua, a global fellowship of Jewish disciples of Jesus, and he's the president emeritus of the Messianic Jewish Theological Institute. And if you remember Jen's episode, he came up because he has been an influential voice in some of the things that she's been thinking through and working out. So, Mark Kinzer.
Mark Kinzer. I'm just going to dive in and start quoting some stuff right off the bat. First paragraph. This present volume reflects the intense interest felt by many today in the Jewish roots of their Christian faith. It demonstrates the perennial appeal of studies that aim to shine light on the ecclesia in its earliest phases. But the current interest is novel in focus. For in previous centuries, most Christians thought of Judaism as a legalistic and arid religion that paled by comparison with Christianity. Many Christians now admire Judaism and are eager to trace their own tradition back to such a respected source. Here's just a few I'm just pulling out some quotes like the middle of paragraphs here, but I like these quotes. Listen to this. The recovery of Jewish roots offers the promise of recovering the ecclesia's Jewish character. That's going to be an idea he uses all throughout this chapter, is the idea of the ecclesia, the church's Jewish character. Another quote, "My concern in the present essay is the recovery of the Jewish character of the ecclesia in the present and future. To be Jewish, the ecclesia, the church, needs," I love this quote. Okay, I'm going to read this. "To be Jewish, the ecclesia needs Jews, and it needs them to live in a way that accentuates rather than hides their identity as Jews." So again, for like some of those people that said, "Oh, I feel like I'm on the outside." No. What I'm trying to do is fulfill this thing that I'm probably doing it very poorly. All right. I'll qualify that. I'm probably not doing it well, but I want to be kind of a fulfillment of what Mark is talking about here. To be Jewish, the ecclesia needs Jews, and it needs them to live in a way that accentuates rather than hides their identity as Jews. Here, a little bit later, he says, "Here there is attention given to historical roots, but the roots in question are those that produced enmity and separation rather than those that yielded a hidden continuity." He's kind of speaking of like what we've experienced in the past and how it probably needs to change in the future. Next section, he starts off by saying this: "For Christians who esteem the Jewish tradition, it is self-evident that at a certain point or points in their history, the ecclesia took a wrong turn. Her proper consciousness of her own election expanded to include an improper judgment concerning genealogical Israel's rejection. But this wrong turn can be understood in two different ways. The first accepts the separation of the two communities as necessary, providential, and irreversible historical development. Many of the attitudes and behaviors that accompanied this differentiation were sinful, but the differentiation itself was divinely ordained. Such a perspective on the separation is commonly held by Christians engaged in Jewish-Christian dialogue, since it poses no threat to the current identities of each dialogue partner." So the first view is that, listen, Jews and Christians separated, they were severed, there was a schism, but that schism, and there was sin involved, but that schism was ultimately ordained and designed by God and necessary for the people of God to move forward. That's one view. And Brent, how about you read us that next quote there from Philip Cunningham? It sets up this. You can see this view at work.
Yeah, this is a Catholic thinker. "I think most Christians and Jews unthinkingly assume that something went wrong with the parting of the ways, the origins of Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism as separate communities. This separation is thought to have been contrary to God's will. I suggest an alternative presupposition to something went wrong in retelling the Christian story today. Why can we not suppose that the origins of our two traditions unfolded according to God's will?"
Right. Yeah. And that, again, that's a great quote to demonstrate the first take. This is kind of your first option. Here's Kenzer. Kenzer says the main problem with this construal is Christological. It suggests that Jesus has no significance for the Jewish people apart from the creation of a new Gentile assembly rooted in Israel's story. Jesus may still have significance for individual Jews who accept his claims, but they then become a part of a Gentile assembly and so presumably leave their Jewish identity behind. The Jewish people, on the other hand, continue on as they did before, untouched by their corporate life, by the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. This is a strange way of construing a message concerning one who died with the words "King of the Jews" inscribed above his head, and whose name became forever linked to Israel's royal title, Christos Mashiach. But this Christological problem also has ecclesiological consequences. If the story of Jesus has no significance for the Jewish people as a people, then the resurrected Jesus has no particular point of ongoing contact with his own kin beyond what he has with all human beings, and so also has no point of contact to offer the Gentile assembly gathered in his name. All right, so that's one take. That's the first take, and Kinzer's kind of critique of that take. Then he goes on to say this: the second approach is the wrong turn challenges the necessity of the separation itself. Christians who take this approach view the parting as a tragic schism rather than a providential differentiation. Do you want to read he quotes another source here. Brent, do you want to read the Yoder quote that's in there?
Yeah, the historical development of the first 3 centuries of our era ended with the presence, in many of the same places, of 2 separate, mutually exclusive systems, intellectual, cultural, and social, called Jews and Christians. Therefore, the standard account claims that this mutual exclusiveness must be assumed to have been inevitable, that is, logically imperative, even when and where the actors in the story which led to that outcome did not know that yet.
Yeah, quoting Kinzer, Yoder then challenges this assumption. If God's purpose might have been to offer a different future from the one which actually came to be, then we do not do total justice to God's intent in the story by reading it as if the outcome he did not want, but which did happen, had to happen. So Yoder's saying, well, let me see. I think actually Kinzer's going to say it quite well here. As articulated by Cunningham, the first perspective on the split accepts the Gentile character of the ecclesia, while nevertheless asserting that she is rooted in Israel's story. The ecclesia thus has a relationship to Israel through a partially shared narrative, but she does not reside in the midst of Israel, nor does Israel reside in her midst. The second perspective, on the other hand, presumes that such a mutual indwelling was divinely willed, and only rebellious human actions severed the visible bond. It is this second way of defining the wrong term of the ecclesia that befits Christians seeking not only a better relationship with Jesus, but also the recovery of the Jewish character of their own faith and life. And Brent, I think we would definitely represent, of the two, which one of the two, the first or the second?
I think the latter. And I would like to emphasize severing the visible bond, because regardless of what you think, there are Jewish roots to Christianity. So whether you want to bring those out in the open and acknowledge them or not, they are there. So the severing was of the visible bond, where you try to hide it and not acknowledge it, but that bond is still there.
Right. Yes. And to summarize, take number 1 says the schism was God's plan and needs to be there. Part 2 was the schism was not a part of God's plan and was a result of our own brokenness and humanity. We take very clearly in session 5, we depict it as a horrible tragedy. Take number 2. Kinzer goes on. Here's a few random quotes here. In this essay, I'm focusing on the character of the ecclesia and her role in the Jewish-Christian schism. A little bit later, he says, Jewish corporate identity in the early centuries of the Common Era was founded on the conviction that genealogical Israel was beloved, chosen, and set apart by the creator of the universe for a particular priestly task in the world. So he says, in the first century, Jewish identity found its identity in the fact that there was a mission that they were a part of to bring, to partner with God as a kingdom of priests in the world. A little bit later, he says, the heart of ecclesial identity, so church identity from her earliest days, was the conviction that Jesus was the Messiah of Israel and the Lord of the universe. Later, he says, Jewish and ecclesial core affirmations did not inevitably morph into mutual boundary-setting negations. Our ancestors were responsible agents, and their corporate decisions resulted in the partitioning of Judeo-Christianity. We must live with the historical consequences of those decisions, but we are not doomed to sanctify their choices or repeat their mistakes. We are responsible agents, and our responsibility includes the obligation to assess their actions in light of the possibilities that have opened up in our own day.
No get out of jail free cards here.
Nope, absolutely not. One more little trip here, and then we'll summarize kind of the rest of the chapter, Brent. Next section, Kinzer says, the denial of each other's core affirmations resulted eventually in mutually exclusive communal identities. The Gentile assembly of Christians could now relate to the Jewish people only as a reality alien to its own corporate self. But what about those who embraced both core affirmations and did so as genealogical descendants of the patriarchs and matriarchs? The imagery of separation, rupture, or schism suggests two parties that once shared a common social space and then at some point or points ceased to do so. A little bit later, he says the Jesus Gentiles had been initiated into a Jewish social and cultural environment that demanded that they renounce worship of their ancestral gods. They had joined a community centered in Jerusalem and led by Jews. But these Gentiles did not thereby become Jews. A little bit later, when the signs of acute stress surfaced in the 2nd century, 3 corporate characters appeared in the drama. Not just 2, he says 3, rather than merely 2. Number 1, you had the wider Jewish community. Number 2, you had the Jewish members of the ecclesia. And number 3, you had the emerging Gentile Christian church. And so what Kinzer will do is he's going to spend the next kind of sections of his chapter essentially talking about how does this if there's not just 2 groups with one schism, but actually 3 groups, does this 3rd group that he's referring to as Messianic Judaism kind of open a door to that healing of the schism that Jen Rosner writes about? Is Messianic Judaism play a part in this larger scheme of things? And so he goes through and he just kind of talks about that. He talks about what's happening in Judaism. He talks about what's happening in Christianity, particularly what happened in Catholic thought recently in the last, recent history.
Yeah, the quote we read from the Catholic guy previously does not represent what we're going to see later from some other Catholic thinkers.
Thank you for saying that. I wanted to say that earlier, and I forgot to work that in. So yes, actually Catholicism has actually helped pave the way for a lot of these renewed Jewish-Christian dialogue, and we're very much indebted to the Catholic Church for some of the things that they've done for that. Closing little bit here from Mark in his chapter. The ecclesia now has the opportunity to rediscover her Jewish roots and to recapture her Jewish character. In so doing, she may experience an unanticipated fruit in spheres that seem distant from the matter at hand. More is at stake than meets the natural eye. Something extraordinary has occurred in recent centuries among Jews who believe in Jesus. Through them, an exit ramp may lead off the highway of schism with signs pointing back to the road not taken long ago. May all members of the ecclesia be blessed with eyes to see, ears to hear, and hands to turn the wheel. Amen to that. Next chapter, Brent.
Well, before we go on, I just want to maybe bring out a practical example of this. So the idea that he's talking about is the Jewish roots and Jewish character of the church. And it's talking about it in a sense of we're all supposed to be in this one common community. And so one of the things that comes up is the idea of cultural appropriation. And so what I feel like I'm hearing from this chapter is that there should be a Jewish character to the church. There should be Jews in the church, and that we should be having a common experience. So for me as a Gentile to participate in a Seder meal would be appropriate and probably encouraged, although not required. But for me as a Gentile to take a whole group of other Gentiles without any Jewish presence and create our own Seder meal, that would be appropriation. And that's the negative sense, is if I take away the root and I take away, the source of the tradition, then I'm appropriating it versus participating in it in the sense that the root is there, the Jews are in my community, and I am participating in the experience with them.
Yes, and that's a really good distinction. And there will be other people that see it differently. This is the nuance of the conversation about appropriation and Jewish and Gentile identity in Yeshua, in Jesus. But yes, the ideal, I would say God's design. Take number 2. There was a design that we screwed up. But the design was that the Gentiles, no matter how big of a community they were, they would have been invited into a Jewish context. It was a Jewish body, a Jewish tree. Everything about it was a Jewish movement, and they were being invited in, and their presence was completely immersive. So they would have been in a community that had a Seder meal. They would have been in a community that practiced Sukkot. They would have been in a community that was Jewish and did all these Jewish things, of which they were included without eating kosher, without being under covenant, but yet they would have been in a community that led God's people in that way. And from that, they would have learned, experienced. Now we live in this severed community, completely severed from the two. And so what some people have done is they said, well, without healing that schism, I want to just do the Jewish thing. I think that's dangerous. Some groups have said, well, rather than healing the schism, we're just going to become Jewish. I'm going to start eating kosher. I'm going to start doing. But I think we tried to lay out that's very not what the New Testament invites us to do. And Paul says, I believe this screws up the gospel. So what we have is a world where we're not living in the ideal, where this Gentile faith is immersed in a Jewish context. And what do you do with that schism and that divide? And that's not easy to answer at all, as we're going to see multiple authors say here today. But you have articulated that absolutely correctly, Brent. There is something different than having a community that has a Passover meal, that has invited Gentiles to partake, than a group of Gentiles with no Jewish presence saying they're going to have a Passover meal on their own, and it's their Passover meal. I still think there's a way to do that. A group of Gentiles to engage the Seder meal from an educational, very intentionally educational perspective. I think there's room for that. It's going to be hard not to offend our Jewish brothers and sisters, which should matter to us. Do not consider yourself, but consider others more important than yourself. Lay yourself, like this matters. If our Jewish brothers and sisters are telling us that's so offensive, there's got to be a way to do that well. But there is something totally different when a group of Gentiles says, this is my identity, this is my story. That's not quite what we've been seeing, studying, and encountering, and that's something different, I think. That's my opinion. For all of you out there listening, and you're like, well, I'm offended by that. You do not have to embrace that. That is me saying, this is how I have come to wrestle with some of these nuances, because I've heard too many Jewish friends say, I'm not okay with the way Christians are posturing themselves and relating to Judaism. It's not right. And I want to hear that and wrestle with that.
And I think part of my recoil is from my upbringing and being taught the idea of America as a melting pot.
Yeah.
And so in my mind, I'm like, what do you mean appropriation? Like, isn't everything appropriation? Isn't everything we do like from somewhere else? And aren't we supposed to take ideas from everywhere and mix them up and create something new? So I think that's my like instinctual reflex when I hear someone speak against cultural appropriation. But I think what's lacking in many cases is that respect for others, considering others before yourself. I think that's the part, like if you have that and can engage in that respect, then when you have a community of people and they bring different ideas together and create something new out of it, or even just engage in something that has been a tradition for thousands of years, it's just a whole different thing when you have that element of respect, which was not part of the original teaching. So I don't know.
Yep. No, I 110%. It's great.
I do get the impression in many cases that my ideas of history and whatever as I was growing up somehow doesn't line up with a lot of other people's. So I don't really know how I got away with some of the ideas that I have, because a lot of people seem to have been taught something different than me. So we don't have time to get into all of that. So let's just go to chapter 12.
Chapter 12.
So we have Christian churches. What difference does the Jewishness of Jesus make? By Archbishop Foley Beach. And he is the Archbishop of the Anglican Church in North America, Bishop of the Diocese of the South in the Anglican Church in North America, and General Secretary of the Global Anglican Fellowship Conference, whose churches contain 80% of the world's 85 million Anglicans. So, yeah, I've learned a lot about Anglicanism as I've read this book, actually, and we didn't cover, I think, the chapter that spoke most directly to it, but the Anglican community is a big part of this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And for anybody interested, there's a whole chapter we didn't cover, and get the book and read it and read that part of the chapter. Yeah, I'm going to jump into some things that Archbishop Foley says here. Was Jesus really Jewish? No doubt. He was not only Jewish, but his whole frame of reference was Jewish, which means he always looked at his life and God through a Jewish lens. He said he came to fulfill Mosaic Jewish law, that his disciples were to keep and teach even the least of its commandments. When asked by somebody how to inherit eternal life, he asked, what does the Jewish law say? When the Pharisees asked him about divorce, he turned to what Moses commanded. He suggested that his earthly ministry was less for the Gentiles and more for the lost Jewish sheep of Israel. When he challenged his contemporaries' interpretations of Jewish law, he did not reject the law, but offered new ways to interpret the law. Never did he suggest that he was turning away from Judaism. Instead, he said he came to proclaim the fulfillment of Judaism in himself and his church. He's going to go on to kind of talk about the deity of Jesus, and then the section ends with this. What about his humanity? What kind of humanity was it? Writings of the New Testament present Jesus with a Jewish humanity. Let's briefly examine this. So he has a whole section on Jesus was born in the midst of Judaism, so his context was Jewish. Jesus was raised in a Jewish family that practiced their faith. They were observant. They practiced. There's a whole section on Jesus lived the lifestyle of a religious Jewish man. So he had Jewish observance. He was Torah observant. We can see that clearly in the text.
A lot of those little details in the text that I think I've, at least me growing up, I've had a tendency to read over as just like, oh, whatever. Like, that's not really the meat of what he's saying. Like, that's not the truth behind what he's talking about. But all of those details, like, if you pay attention to them, you see, like, yeah, totally.
Absolutely. And it does matter. And so he ends this chapter with a really thorough and long section talking about the implications. What are the implications for modern day followers of Jesus? And there's going to be 6 of them, Brent. I'm going to list them here. And if you have anything to add, you feel free. Number 1, because Jesus was Jewish, there should be no anti-Semitism among followers of Jesus. It would seem like a incongruent.
One of those things that, I grew up thinking like, yeah, of course. But apparently a lot of Christian traditions have not, like, I seriously do not understand. Like, it just, I can't wrap my mind around anti-Semitism at all. And yet it is so prevalent in Christian circles. So,
Yep. Sadly so. Number 2, because Jesus was Jewish, modern followers of Jesus should desire to understand the Hebrew roots of their faith. If that's who our Lord was, we need to understand those roots. That's what Bema is all about. Like, literally, that's what it's in. Well, I don't know if it's what it's all about, but it's definitely a big part of what it's about. Number 3, because Jesus was Jewish, followers of Jesus should value the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, or I would say the Hebrew Scriptures, and the Tanakh. We definitely get that wrong, don't we, Brent?
Yeah, didn't value that at all.
Yeah, not so much we as in Bema or whatever, but just Christendom in general has let the Tanakh slip into a different category, and it needs to redeem that. Number 4, because Jesus was Jewish, modern followers of Jesus should seek to understand his teachings in light of his Hebrew background. So we need to understand that when Jesus teaches a parable, when he teaches, anything that Jesus taught, any words that came out of his mouth, the life that he lived and the ministry that he had, it comes through a Hebrew Jewish filter. And we need to understand that so that we can understand what those teachings are and interpret his life and his teachings and his words correctly, accurately.
Yeah, and maybe this was my lack of interest in history, but I did not grow up with the idea of the importance of cultural context in any historical setting, let alone in a biblical setting.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Number 5, because Jesus was Jewish, we should seek to share Jesus with our Jewish friends. That's probably the one I struggle with the most in this list, Brent, just because of how poorly it's been done.
Yeah, sure. Typically, it's been shared at the end of the tip of a sword, and that is not the right approach. Let's just say that.
Well, and even in the modern era with the rise of the evangelism of evangelicalism and our like intellectual at like, no, you have to understand that Jesus is your Messiah and this is the truth. And we're, ugh, 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 ugh. So I affirm number 5, but it's the hardest one to execute and apply well in my perspective. Last one, number 6, because Jesus was Jewish, we followers of Jesus owe a great debt to the Jewish people. Which, as somebody who wrote me an email recently said, it's kind of weird, Marty, when you say that. And I'll recognize that. So I'm not going to harp on that. I'm going to share go ahead.
I will extend that to basically every tradition. Like when we think our way is the only way, we miss so many things. Like, yes, at the base level, we owe a great debt to the Jewish people. But in more recent times, in light of this conversation, in light of what we've gone through in this book, we owe a great debt to the Catholics who have moved this conversation forward. We owe a great debt to the Anglicans. We owe a great debt to various German and Swiss scholars who started to think about things in a different way. Like there's so much more. Like we didn't just show up here randomly. Like we had to get here somehow. And so when we know where our beliefs come from and how the conversation has evolved over the centuries, we owe a great debt to a lot of people. And so it's good to recognize that.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
down at that fundamental level, like the Jewish people brought us Jesus himself.
Yeah, so. Right. In a very literal sense. And I think of Paul's words to the Galatians, like as he's trying to convince this group of Gentile converts that they're wanting to become Jewish because life would just be so much easier. And he's saying, you can't do that. And yet in the midst of that conversation, he says, listen, Judaism and Torah got us here. And I think the implication of what Paul says, I'll let you all wrestle with that back in session 4. But I think the implication of what Paul is saying is we could not have gotten to Jesus without kind of going through the Judaism that lies before it. It's a part of the narrative. It's a part of the story. You just can't go from the Garden of Eden to Jesus, at least not in the story that God's telling as he chose to tell it. You have to kind of go through. And so we do this new Gentile awakening in Christ, this Gentile inclusion in Christ stands on the shoulders of a Judaism that for centuries and centuries and centuries ate kosher. They wore a particular kind of clothing. They engaged in a particular kind of, social structure. All those things, they were circumcised. They carried, they engaged in secular idolatry. In particular, they bore the burden and the heat of the day, to use a quote from Jesus's parable. And so, yeah, I think that fits very, very closely with what Paul is trying to stress in his own teaching in the book of Galatians. So, nevertheless, I digress. I think we're ready for chapter 13, Brent.
So, last chapter, we have Christian Theology. What Difference Does This Make? By Gerald R. McDermott, the editor of this entire volume. By the way, I don't know if we've mentioned his name as much in the last couple of episodes, but he was the Anglican Chair of Divinity at Beeson Divinity School, taught in the areas of history and doctrine, world religions, Anglican studies, and Jonathan Edwards, but he retired in 2020, and he has got all kinds of books, and this being the most recent, I believe.
Yeah, and it was a great way to close the whole read. I just really appreciated how he kind of closed it and wrapped it up and added some additional thoughts and put a cherry on top and bada boom, bada bing. But let's see here. What difference does it make that Jesus and all the apostles and the New Testament itself was thoroughly Jewish? Much in every way. A little bit later, he says, I would add that Jesus came to bring the Jewish religion to a new stage and that now its Messiah had finally arrived. And his understanding of the law brought what some rabbis taught the Messiah would bring, the Messiah's Torah, or the law of Christ. As most translations render Paul's words in Galatians 6, verse 2, and 1 Corinthians 9, verse 21. That's juicy, huh? I never read I need to look more into that, Brent. I haven't necessarily encountered that up until now.
Yeah. Love those translation things.
Yeah, absolutely. A little bit later, a quote. He says, "The other tenants to whom he's talking about the vineyard, the parable of the vineyard. When Jesus says that he's going to lease the vineyard, God's going to lease the vineyard out to other tenants. The other tenants to whom the vineyard would be let must likely represent the new Messianic Jewish leadership, the apostles, with whom Jesus intends to reconstitute the 12 tribes." I'm trying to think if that's how I have interpreted that. I'm not sure that's how I interpret that, Gerald, but that's okay. I like that. Give us something to think about. There you go. Maybe we can go back and listen to that episode, Brent, and figure out if that's, I mean, it's close to what we posited in our episode. I don't know. We'll see.
And I do think we have made a connection between the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles. So
Yeah. There we go. We did it. Just
there's
in a
some,
roundabout
there's some
way.
elements in there.
All right. I'll go with it. Let's see here. Christians, such as Anglicans and Catholics, who refer to their clergy as priests, should note that what they call priestly ministry is in continuity with, not fundamentally at odds with, the ministry of Hebrew priests, because they participate in the new high priestly ministry of the true priest who remains a Jew. I like that. That was a good way to word that. Good job, Gerald. Let's see here. A little bit later, he talks about he's saying that he liked Kenzer's admonitions that Christians need to affirm not merely the Jewish roots, but the Jewish character of the gospel. Paul says that the church consists of branches on a tree supported by Jewish roots, not a separate tree growing from different seeds. I'll read that again. They should heed Kenzer's admonition that Christians need to affirm not merely the Jewish roots, but the Jewish character of the gospel. Paul says the church consists of branches on a tree supported by Jewish roots, not a separate tree growing from different seeds. It's a great way of phrasing that. Gerald Little later says, "I want to go further and suggest that this book should make us reconsider 4 words that are at the heart of our Christian faith." So he's going to start to work towards a closing here by suggesting 4 words we need to reconsider, Brent. The first word is the word Christ. He says we should reconsider Christ. Now, he's saying that in terms of what it means that Jesus is a Jewish Messiah, not just an abstract Messiah, but the Messiah of Israel. I would add to that, personally, this is Marty speaking, I would add to that a re-examination of the Pauline usage. When Paul uses the term Christ, how does he use it? I am in agreement with Richard Rohr that I think Paul is using that term Christ in a much more expansive way. So I affirm both. I think both of those things need to be reconsidered because I think they're both very relevant to the conversation. Second word, the word Jews, especially the way we read it in the Gospel of John in church, especially in John. There's a huge conversation about that. And there's a lot of articles about the word. The word is udoi. I can't remember if that's Greek or if I'm saying that. That's the word that's stuck in my head, and I can't remember. But I'm pretty sure that's the Greek. Udoi. Udoi is the word for Jews, but it usually references, not all the time, which makes it very tricky, but it often references, and the scholarly debate is how much it's referencing Judean Jews, like a Judean worldview, not just Jews. So whenever you're reading the Gospel of John, he's always like, and the Jews came out and did this. Well, you can't just translate it as Jews because then it's not consistent with the other things that John says in his Gospel. So John has to be using that term in some kind of specific way, and we need to consider that when we're reading our Bible. Brent, you've been with me in Israel whenever that word comes up, and I throw my hat and I shriek because I hate how we have, that's our anti-Semitism coming through in our translation.
Yep. And this is actually a fairly lengthy section. Like he's listing these 4 words, and the first word is a pretty simple, it's just like a single paragraph. But then the second word, he actually goes through quite a bit of the text and examples and stuff. So I would say read it, but also we may get back to it in the somewhat near future.
Ooh, snap. All right, I love it. Whetting the appetite. Let's see here. After Christ and Jews, there's another word we use in translation in worship we should consider. That's the word law. He says we need to reconsider what the word law means. And he goes on to talk about that with some length. And then finally, he says this, then there is what, according to scholars of the last few centuries, was at the center of Jesus' gospel message, kingdom. Kingdom. And he says we need to re-examine what the word kingdom means, and he has some comments on that.
And boy, I really hope that we have a better idea of what that might mean as Baymont listeners.
Yeah, I would certainly hope so, especially with our conversation about narrative and what gospel narrative and that genre is. In those comments talking about kingdom, he ends up talking about Revelation, and then he says this about those comments on Revelation. Some might protest that this is symbolic language in the most symbolic book of the Bible. And it's not clear, they might add, what the relation between the kingdom of Israel and the renewed earth to come. True enough. But in that same book of Revelation, it says that the renewed earth will have signs of Israel at its center. The nations will walk in it. The saints will see the Lamb face to face. There will be things to see and places to walk. It will be visible and not just invisible, Jewish, not just Gentile. It will not have boring Enlightenment style sameness, but the beautiful divine diversity of Jews and Gentiles, Israel and the nations, men and women, all will be oriented to the Messiah, but each in ways suited to their differences. Let us think of kingdom in these ways, better informed by the Jewish character of both testaments. Oh, I like that paragraph. That was good. And speaking of paragraphs that I like, I think I have enough time, Brent, without making this the longest episode. I'm going to read his closing few paragraphs here because I liked it. It's a good way to close our study. There are implications for theology. What if non-Messianic Israel is still beloved to God? How does this change our view of God's covenants? If the one that most Christians had thought was obsolete is still in force, and of the new covenant, which Christians prize? If the first covenant still prevails, how does that change our view of the covenant that Jesus inaugurates? Should we take the lead of some theologians who argue that since there's no separate Hebrew word for renewed that differs from new, and since Israel's history is full of covenant renewals, that perhaps Jesus' covenant meal is another renewal for the one covenant which God made with Israel? I personally like that take.
Yeah, hello.
Okay, back to his quote. There are implications for Christians' relations with their Jewish friends and neighbors. Should we Christians be surprised that our Jewish friends do not warm to hearing about Jesus when most have relatives who died in the Holocaust at the hands of people who often identified as Christians? When most Jews know that Christians killed tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Jews over the centuries before the Holocaust, perhaps we Christians should try to learn the basics of that history before trying to engage with Jewish friends and neighbors in religious dialogue. Amen, Gerald. I write closing paragraph. These are hard things to think about. There are few easy answers, but most important matters are like that. Let us not refuse to wrestle with these because they are difficult. We Christians should keep wrestling, especially if we discover that the particular stream of Christian tradition to which we have been raised is supersessionist. Let us continue to search the scriptures and our shared histories with fresh recognition of not only Christianity's Jewish roots, but also the Jewish character of the New Testament. By exploring the history of faith and faith of the people whom God loves, we will learn more about God himself. And with that, we close our study, kind of led by understanding the Jewish roots of Christianity, biblical, theological, and historical essays on the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, edited by the same guy who wrote that chapter, Gerald R. McDermott.
It's a great read. Some chapters more challenging than others.
Yep.
In a conceptual way and in a convicting way.
Yep.
But lots of good stuff. Lots of stuff for the theology nerds. Some good history for people who like studying history. Lots and lots of good stuff. A little bit of something for everyone, I hope.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, well, that'll do it for this episode of the Bama Podcast. We'll be back next week with Reed Dent. That'll be exciting.
Yeah, whatever. Nah, Reed always does a good job. He's the team member I'm going to give the hardest time to. It's just what happens. It's my love language.
Yes, it's great. Anyway, you can get a hold of Marty on Twitter at Marty Solomon. I am at EIBCB. And you can find us all on Slack, including Reed Dent, if you want to get him hyped up for his episode next week. But you can find more details about the show at BamaDiscipleship.com. So thanks for joining us on the Bama Podcast. We'll talk to you again soon.
Gerald, what did he say? I would say, I don't know why I just call him Gerald as if I know him. Hope he never listens to
Jen
this.
called him Jerry, and I'm like, wow, okay, I guess.
She's in that community. She can do that. She knows him. I won't. I'll stop short of Jerry. What difference does it make that Jesus and all the apostles and the New Testament itself were thoroughly Jewish? Man. Jewish. Why do I have such a hard time saying that word? It's becoming my new word that I struggle with.